Hello, good morning. I just wanted to start off early. Well, it's noon here in Mountain Standard Time. What I mean by early is I've got off the phone and I have this conversation fresh in my old brain, and I wanted to get it out there before it filters into the universe. So, yesterday's podcast was about the criminal defense or the lawsuit against a lawyer, Brian from Sutina, longtime lawyer in Sutina. Now, what does Sutina have to do with all this that's happening with Danielle Smith and her cohorts of pretendians? Well, it's taken years. It's sort of percolating to the top, and my whole gist about Nathan Chasing Horse, that's 20 years ago. Like, I'm talking about systemic racism, colonial ways of thinking, misogyny, lateral violence, just percolating over the past 20 years. Now, at the same time, too, I've had some really good white friends, cohorts and allies, not pretendians, actual cohorts and allies. And like I said, I'm trying to do this right from the start fresh. When I was interviewed by the Fifth Estate, this lady said to me, Marina, because they had just broken the story of Buffy St. Marie, the greatest pretendian of them all. Like, that's appropriate to start off this whole smear of pretendianism and false cohorts and allies. She's one of them. Broke the whole story. And this lady said to me what they uncovered when they were investigating Nathan Chasing Horse and his circle, like the cult, that there was a lot of things that they couldn't publish because the CBC had taken so much criticism when it came to exposing the Queen of Pretendians. Now, that's 3 years, 2 years ago? So again, I'm saying things have been percolating. Even before then, before we had our council election, there was a young man. He'd have, community meetings. And I did talk to him. I spoke to him about my own understanding of how the chief and council, certain leadership, had protected Nathan Chasing Horse by paying rent for his followers in various parts of the United States, wherever they were living. And again, I'm going to say names with some of them, but I have to say the former chief because he's involved in this lawsuit when it comes to this lawyer that the chief had hired and had been around. This lawyer had been around for decades. So Chief Roy Whitney, like his childhood, like I'm the same age as him, but I went to Bishop Grandin in high school, and he had a reputation of denying that he was indigenous. Walked around, his father had a nickname because he was this indigenous culture worker for students. And they called him Cover Girl. And I used to say, why? Like, whenever there was a cruel statement, I'd always say, why, playing the innocent? Well, it was because he would put on white makeup so he'd look more white than indigenous. So it percolated from the father to the son. Now, using religiosity and shit like that, I have a white friend, and we were talking, and I'm talking to some other women this just a few days and hours ago, and I said I didn't even know what the software Grinder was. Now, if you don't know, look it up, because I said, yeah, all these Republican conferences they have in the United States, and this website Grinder crashes, and I said, and also too, like what is the difference? Like Muslims, like in Iran, like in the 70s, the women had rights. They were, their faces weren't hidden. They were openly wearing, regular female attire. They weren't wearing burqas, nothing. Why am I saying this? Because this whole shit percolating from Danielle Smith and the USA and Grindr, will say, and even that fellow who just died at 71, and all these the mistresses or misters, the transsexual people he had affairs with, are coming out because he paid them to be silent. Now that he's dead, like it's free for all. But that's the way what happens with death and how you live your life. And for me, like I said, I'm an elder. This is my opinion. Whatever my legacy is when I do pass, like am I going to be devastated that nobody shows up to my funeral? Hell no. I think life is meant to enjoy and live. Even though I've made mistakes with people I've acquainted myself with throughout the years, like it's live and learn, especially when you're a minority and you have pretendian cohorts. But I regress. The lady from the Fifth Estate had said, they could have done a deeper, in-depth job. But I do think there was more to it. And I'll explain as I'm going along, talking about these issues of patriarchy and misogyny and lateral violence. So understand this. I've been involved with radical movements in terms of, people having conspiracies or like taking away the rights of indigenous people. And when I look in my community and I look at my dad and his first cousin and how hard they worked. My dad installed central heating and plumbing, and so did his cousin. For the first time, like they had to take out loans. And this was 60 years ago. A lot of things have changed, like even alcohol coming into the community. So a lot of the shame of being indigenous and poor really resonated. And so I grew up in a community where I actually could see people who were ashamed to be indigenous. Now, how they dealt with it and whether or not they healed from intergenerational trauma, like we're still living in it. Now, recently, like I said in my podcast yesterday, this lawyer, Brahm, had sent emails to this construction worker who was associated with Danielle Smith. His M.R.E. Marsky or Sam Marsky. I'm saying his name wrong. But that man and his association with the building construction company, and that 10% of $38 million was given to him when only 10% of the work was done. All this was sort of quickly done before the old chief and council were voted out. I mean, there's still some old chief and council that are cohorts in this. But the reality of it is it took a group of young men and women to expose this lawsuit. We went to a band council meeting and there was argument. There was hundreds of people because everybody knew this lawyer. Oh my goodness, a white god, white savior, complex. Even my own cousin, no, he's a good man. I had relatives saying, "Oh, how dare you!" And then you have friends of this lawyer says, "Look, we've worked with him for decades. Yes, he's a good man, but we had to let him go." Now it's exposed why they had to let him go. They didn't expose it during the band meeting. They said, "We have to wait. It's we've got lawyers working on it." Wham, bang, thank you, ma'am. Shit hit the fan a couple of days ago. Got some band members saying, "Why didn't we know about this shit?" Hey, if you were at the band meeting and you were listening, what weren't you thinking? Why didn't you use your intuitive skills and, trust the people that are voted in and ask them? Establish some trust, damn it. Because, geez, if people come to me and ask me questions, I'll be serious. When the Fifth Estate asked me and I said, "Look, the band, our leadership, talked to them," and I gave them lists of leadership, and the reality is the two former chiefs had gone, and even band members that were related to these former chiefs had approached one of the ladies who was paying off reserve housing. Now understand this, when you're elected into a position of power and you're supposed to protect the vulnerable, the poor, these are children, and under the guise of spirituality and cultural identity, you pay the rent of a 14 and 15-year-old for 20 years? Excuse me. And then you have the audacity to approach off-reserve housing and threaten them with their jobs if they do not pay that rent. Like, really. Now that's part of colonial way of thinking. That's how the white man came into Sutina, trained all these people who are a couple of years older than me, 4 to 5 years, 6 years older than me. I think once they got their high school education, they were deemed fit to learn on-the-job training. Well, they learned their jobs pretty damn good. When I was director of education, I found out where all this money was going, and it was going to, one of the original men who had been trained, and he knew how to hide that money in his own program. So anyway, as I was saying a couple of years ago, well, there was a head controller in Sutina who had 27 pages of accounting that could show where the money was going in terms of the chief having money siphoned into his relative's construction company. Now, there are other band counselors that had money siphoned into their own companies. Like even one used his own relative to take over the company, so it looked like there wasn't any conflict of interest. And yet that individual is being charged with a sexual assault to this day. And the former chief is also charged with 2 historical sexual assaults. One, his was on men and the other was on a woman. The history of misogyny and we'll call rape culture and even lateral violence is so entrenched and smells of hypocrisy. Now, my late father would say, people don't have a backbone. Now, today, even though my father has been gone for almost, 4 decades, 1978, 79, at the age of 52, sorry. He'd say about backbones. Now, as I reflect, I'm going, that meant, for me, it means people who are not ashamed to be indigenous. People who are not ashamed to be indigenous will not put their hand out. People who are not ashamed to be indigenous will not turn the other way when a friend needs them. Now, I said historically, like even in the world, when you go into countries where you have militarized police, and they go into homes and they're knocking in the neighborhood and they knock on your door, even though you've been raised your whole life with these people from childhood, teenager to adult. Knock on the door. Is so-and-so your neighbor? Yes. Are they home? Yes. Have they done this? Yes. They know damn well that by doing that, they're sentencing that person to a firing squad. Well, that's how human beings are when they're ashamed or something about, like they're pretending. And that's like for me, thrown under the bus all the time. Have my fucking opinion, and what do they do? My whole life, somebody writes a letter to chief and council. Word gets back to me, Marina, you wrote a letter. Did not write a letter. Why the hell do people create narratives about me like this? Because they hate me, because I'm an indigenous woman. Now, even this podcast, like I've said, I've met many women across Canada and parts of the United States that have experienced lateral violence. But to the degree of what Danielle Smith has done to Indigenous women at the guise of all her cohorts, like this fellow Sam Mercesi, anyway, in this lawsuit, he. Let's all start off first with the Native Women's Shelter. I used to be a board member for the Native Women's Shelter eons ago, and one of the reasons I stepped down was because I realized I was just a signing figure. I was they were using me just to sign checks, and I didn't feel comfortable about that because, again, one of the ladies who again too was volunteering. I mean, I didn't know they were getting their money because I would they were making money. And here I was signing checks. So wait, hold on. Let me put it this way. Lateral violence. One of the ladies in the board was suffering from limerence. And to this day, decades later, she still hasn't recovered from limerence. So Yes, when I have a topic and when I talk about limerence and lateral violence and intergenerational trauma, like how it affects women, one of my acquaintances would call me because she knew I was on the board. And at the time, there was legal litigation between the former executive director of the women's shelter and this new board. Come to find out, like Danielle Smith has been putting her cohorts in different First Nations non-charity organizations, non-profit. So what do? They changed the mandate of the Native Women's Shelter. I for the life of me, I just assumed because this person I knew was actually from Treaty 7 that she would stand up for this, and in a way, it sort of blanketed it. Okay, so any money like nonprofit, just how the separatist government or the Danielle Smith regime puts money in and has immigrants, minorities fighting over those dollars. And who's the sacrificial lamb? Indigenous women, the Native Women's Shelter. Now, even though this acquaintance of mine, like I haven't talked to her in a couple of months, and that's fine. I mean, when I needed her 20 years ago, she wasn't there for me when I was, raising the alarm about Nathan chasing horse. It's one thing that women can get together when they want to, like come together for the Wachipi ceremony. But when it comes to come together and banish this man, nobody stepped forward. Now again, this all has to do with people working for the nation, fear of their jobs. Yes, okay, that's it too. But there is a point where you have to step down and say, no, I will not. This goes against my ethics. Shit. Like really, when you see the rippling effect and how much people were trying to raise the alarm about Danielle Smith and her cohorts and their finger in the Native Women's Shelter, like they've changed the name, they've changed everything from the original post of when I was board of director. Now, doesn't that seem sort of funny? But again, too, this was all set up to create fractions against minorities fighting each other for nonprofit money in the city of Calgary. Really, when I'm asked to talk about Indigenous history, this is part of it. This is part of it, that people who come from other countries need to listen to what's happening and what's still going on. Understand this. The leader of the Separatist Party took money from the most vulnerable Cree children in Northern Alberta's trust fund. And he has the audacity to say, let's separate from Alberta, when he is stealing money, the very breast milk of those young Cree children. And again, too, look at the Native Women's Shelter. Who are they supposed to be protecting? The most vulnerable women and children. And again, Sutuna Chief and Council, who are they supposed to be protecting? The most vulnerable women and children. And yet, when women like me get up and say, listen, there's a predator in the flock. Listen, there's somebody out there, in this rape culture, trafficking our girls. Nobody listens. Now, at the same time, too, I talk about the fact that, even we get provincial money for child and family, that doesn't mean that we're sovereign. Because if it meant that we're sovereign, then why the hell, when I'm working with a young woman who's pregnant, children have been apprehended. As soon as she has her baby, she doesn't even see the baby. They take that baby away from her. Within 2 months, she's dead, brokenhearted for being a mother, an Indigenous mother. Now, another lady who was in charge of Nietzsche Institute. Now, I told you that I volunteered to do the first budget for the first detox treatment center in Sutina. And throughout my late mother's life, she worked hard. She trained, she made sure she did all her due diligence in educating herself in addictions. And Nietzsche Institute helped. They helped a whole lot of communities within First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Now, this within Danielle Smith's regime, this fellow who's associated with Sutin and this recovery center that's being built, what the hell did he do? This Sam fellow? He was an instigator in closing Nietzsche. What the fuck? When I talk about pretendians and I'm saying, don't show your fucking status card if you don't know what it's like to live in First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. My mother worked, and all those indigenous people who went through the Nietzsche Institute lived. They didn't live in urban areas. Now, these people have lived knowledge. You give all these PhDs to people and say, oh, well, they're lived knowledge. Where the hell were you when Nietzsche Institute was being closed? These are indigenous people like my late mother would have the capacity to teach other indigenous people about addictions. And what the hell do? You fucking close it down, give that money to Sutina and 11 other organizations in Alberta. 3 of them are indigenous, Sutina, Enoch, and Métis Nation. Now look at the shit that hit the fan because of how corrupt our former chief is. And our lawyer, what the hell did he do? Giving information to this Sam, Danielle Smith's Sam. And what the hell, all this news media? One of the band council women going up to the legislation saying, I'm talking on behalf of Chief Roy Whitney. Bullshit. I said, he just threw her out to be like I said, a male buck will send the does out into the field first to see if the coast is clear. So if there's any hunters there, he's not going to get shot. He sacrifices one of the does. Well, that's what this chief did to this band council woman, and she took it. She's taken it her whole life. Talk about fucking treaty rights shit. Meantime, she's being manipulated and doesn't even damn well know it. And she says to me, I don't have to deal with Indian residential school and the trauma I faced. My goodness. How much education it's like trying to get water out of a rock. But hey, when I say, yes, when the government appointed the lieutenant governor, a Cree man, to be lieutenant governor, he says, why are they doing this? And I'm pretty sure a lot of the indigenous people who have received honorary PhDs have asked, why are they doing this? Now, and they say, oh, well, it's lived knowledge. It's you've lived your life. This is your experiencing. We're honoring it. In the guise of what? Danielle Smith? The whole premise is like, oh, we're recognizing indigenous people. That's bullshit. I have a white friend who has worked in nonprofit, and she says when we approach the oil companies, they'll just say, just throw money to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, keep them quiet. Well, that's what Danielle Smith has been doing in her cohorts, but at the same time, they've been collecting money and putting it in their fucking pockets. Like you look at that fellow, all this separatist movement. And at the same time, why? Why did this happen here in my community? Again, because people are ashamed to be indigenous. They don't want to look like, oh, I've been poor. I'm not going to be poor. Well, you can't damn well take it with you. But you know what happens? The legacy of our women and children. Now, my hat's off to these young people who, with the new chief and council who are doing this. I'm deeply grateful that they're listening to people like me. Now, I'm not saying what I'm saying they endorse me. I'm doing this independently. This is my own opinion because I've lived here. So I know the structure of Nietzsche Institute and how valuable it is because I have a university degree. I've worked off reserve most of my life. And the fact, too, is like, hello, ever since I was a baby, I was bussed into the city, being around white people, talking white language, coming back to Tsuut'ina, being, with my Sioux mom and my Sioux dad. Like, hello, back and forth. I can, and people have a hard time comprehending this, but hey, for me, it's natural. It's normal. I've been acclimatized to it. And so, yes, of course, I am going to advocate for people. Like the lady who was in charge of Nietzsche Institute, and how they just kicked her out, just said, we're not paying the bills anymore. After how many years? 50 years? I mean, mind you, one of the founders of the Nietzsche Institute is being charged with historical sexual assault. But, I mean, it comes out of the woodwork, people. Like, people can gasp at indigenous people, and I'm going, look at how sad the President of the United States is. Like I was saying, with Muslims in Iran, like they hate women, like men hate women, generally speaking. But okay, at least they say it openly. Okay, and they're open about their homosexuality or their bisexualism or whatever men, in their sexual revolution. Because that's what it seems like, because all of a sudden, poof, it's okay to be just with men, but women are lower than dogs and animals, and they don't have a right. And basically, that's what's been going on here in the Americas, and a lot of women have bought into it. And if we don't watch out, we're going to end up like wearing burqas and hiding our faces. But as an Indigenous woman, seeing that how my mother and my grandmothers lived in that same status, and even in the 70s or 80s, the women were allowed to marry whoever the hell they wanted to marry under the Indian Act. A lot of people don't realize, like, even when you have hate crimes, because of the Indian Act, we don't have the same rights as immigrants. Say Muslims, when they're persecuted in the cities in Canada, they can take their perpetrators to court, but not Indigenous people. So a lot of the immigrants who come into Canada and look at us as if we're lower than dogs and cats and mice, and even lower than a snake's belly. The Sioux have no swear word. The way you call down another human being is saying you're lower than a snake's belly. So yeah. These politicians, they really don't like being lower than a snake's belly, and I'm sorry, but they are. They are, and the tragedy of it all is like, oh my goodness. If Muslim men treat women like this, and Donald Trump treats women like this, and Danielle Smith is buying into this with all her male cohorts, throwing all women under the bus so she can't be lower than a snake's belly. What does it say about women? I'm really grateful I have a white friend. She's 65. Now, you take a white man and a white woman, same position, same job, same everything. Now, for her, she's still struggling. She shouldn't be, because she's a woman in this environment here. But she's a vocal woman. And I treasure the conversations we have, because without her insight and her friendship, I wouldn't have been able to let go of my Indigenous acquaintances. Especially when it's come to my own private life, and just the so-called neediness. Marina is so needy. One of the things my aunt taught her children is not to chase after people. And the reality of it is, like, when you're in limerence, you chase. All people, like everybody, limerence is in everything. But it's the degree of how in depth or how far or how long this limerence has been clinging on to you. It can be very dangerous. So again, all the ceremonies to have identity, the Wachipi, the Sundance, all this to make money. And it's not just in Sutin, it's everywhere. And even the survivors of Nathan Chasing Horse, when I spoke to them to raise alarms about certain spiritual leaders, they already knew. And they said, no, Marina, we know, but we don't, they'll call us, but we don't actively engage. And I'm going, oh, thank you, because, that's the nature of being indigenous, networking, trusting each other, especially when you've been a victim and you have to rise to the occasion and face your fears. So everything that I do isn't because I'm unique. No. I tried to say in my podcast, I'm just one of thousands and thousands of Indigenous women who've lived through this shit, who've advocated and who've worked hard. My mother used to walk 16 miles a day to go to work. My father, even working as a soldier in the military, and the systemic racism and the racial slurs he had to take every day. For what? Like today, it's the grandchildren and the children who remember their grandparents. I'm just really blessed and grateful that I lived so long to see this percolate to the top. I worked in the state hospital in Utah with high suicide risk girls. I was acquainted with the behavior of teenage boys. But when it comes to this recovery center and the gossip and like they said, I think in the news article, they said how many, 40,000 they paid for the communities to understand what this treatment center was. Did I hear anything about it? No. I'm just coming from my own lived knowledge of my own work experience with high-risk suicide girls and my study in psychology, what come may, in terms of like my own mental health. And again, yes, I studied, went to therapies, had a cohort, a friend, so-called, who's an acquaintance now, of 30 years, forensic psychologist. I mean, really, anything and everything I've discussed over the past 20 years hasn't been just gossip. Sure, throw me under the table or under the wagon or under the ice floe, whatever. Try to silence me, and I'm going, no, something's not right. And the reason I'm not friends with this forensic psychologist is because he was a therapist to Roy Whitney. And he never disclosed to me, why he disliked the fact that Roy was enabling Nathan Chasing Horse to thrive in Sutina. He didn't. I thought, okay, it's professional protocol. And, so he never really disclosed Roy's propensity for boys either. Now, all of a sudden, and even this then too, okay, I made sure I went to therapy because I was the caregiver of my mother. And I didn't want to be burnt out either. So I made sure I took care of my mental health. As hard as it was to look after my late mother, I'm grateful. I've learned a lot being a caregiver. And I'm not just making excuses. I'm saying advocacy and this podcast and just the teachings of my late mother and my parents is and my grandparents. Mustn't forget them too. Bless them. But what it's just the whole notion that when I started getting attention from my blog and how my so-called therapist was so intrigued in trying to get information from me, she within a month she had set up a month and a half she had set up 4 therapy meetings, and I'm going, why? And then my so-called acquaintance cohort therapist, forensic psychologist who wasn't my therapist. 30 years ago he'd been my therapist, but he wasn't 3 years ago. Oh my goodness. Talk about throwing me under the bus. wanting a piece of the action when Fifth Estate investigative reporters started calling me. And of course, I was so fucking naive. I talked to my therapist. I talked to Paul, and shit. If it weren't for indigenous activist in Calgary, bless her heart, Darcy knows who I'm talking about. If she hadn't invited me on, if I hadn't asked her to invite me on a podcast, this whole dynamics wouldn't have come to fruition. It wouldn't have percolated to the top. You have to understand too. My one niece, who's in her 50s now, who'd followed Nathan Chasing for 20 years, would confront this lady and say, "Why are you interviewing my aunt? She's not the ideal person to interview." Now, this is coming from my niece, who was supposedly hogtied and raped by Nathan's followers. To this day, will not press charges. To this day, still supports fucking Nathan Chasing Horse. Disassociated or what? But I'm saying this because this was happening during the time when she would call this podcast creator, and tell her, discredit me, not to interview me. And the lady interviewed me twice. The first time with Paul. And she thought that Paul was my therapist. I said, no. He is the main person who I invited to interview my niece, Roberta, who was a danger to herself and others because of how angry she was towards me. Because I was looking after her brother and sister. After my brothers and sisters used up all child and family money, they didn't have any money, so they didn't have no use for our own niece and nephew, so I took them in with my late mother. That's the reason for the forensic psychologist, because he was going to supervise home visits with my niece Roberta and her half-brother and sister. Again, that was the reason I brought Paul into the whole picture of it. Not knowing at the time that he was a therapist to former Chief Roy. And again, here's my therapist wanting to, like, Marina, I'll do a phone interview therapy session for an hour. And I just said to her, I'll reschedule. I haven't rescheduled. Because, like, why do they want the skinny? Why, because she's interviewed over 300 survivors of Indian residential school and got money for that. And she's a white woman using Indian last name because she married an indigenous man and divorced him. Oh, as the fry bread burns, or what is it? What do they say? Take your fascist fry bread and burn it. Yeah, apparently one young woman went to Danielle Smith up in Edmonton with pancake breakfast and said, "Take your fascist pancakes." Well, of course, women should be concerned about this Danielle Smith and the women's, like, how women are being demeaned. When I talk about lateral violence and misogyny, I'm telling you, I feel it. I've grown up with it. I try and tell people when you invite me in to pray and give me tobacco, protect me. I'm coming into territory. I don't know these people, if they're indigenous or not, and if they hate me as an indigenous woman, because I represent their grandmother, mother, auntie, cousin, partner, who the hell knows? They just, because of what I represent. That's why I tell people, if you've been raped, if you've been sexually assaulted, deal with it. You don't want to grow up projecting that all men are rapists. You don't want to hate men that way. Because I live it all the time when people hate women. I got to be vocal about it. It works both ways. But the reality of it is that the majority of what's happening with politics when it comes to people taking advantage of the most vulnerable. My late uncle used to say, "Oh, we lease our land out and the farmers get rich and they're, draining the tit out of Mother Earth from our lands." Bless my uncle's heart. I know everything we do and learn and how we grow up and how people love us is important. And I maybe that's the reason I am who I am, is because of my uncles. I only had one aunt growing up here in Sutina. All my other matriarchal duties came from the Sioux side, because I had all aunties on my mom's side with one uncle. So it was completely like a balance. And you know, I really appreciate all my indigenous cohorts, allies. And again, too, you know, it's sad. It's sad that you know, people want to look at the Muslims and say, oh, look at what they did against women's rights. When here's Danielle Smith doing the same damn thing, and yet there are women following her, got her into that position. What this woman changed the Native Women's Shelter in Calgary. This woman closed Nietzsche Institute in Edmonton. This woman who supports the separatist leader of the province, this lawyer who has taken money out of the mouths of vulnerable Cree children in northern Alberta. This woman who supposedly wasn't even in cohorts with Chief Roy Whitney, because he had to send his female counterpart up to Edmonton to read a letter that he was not in support of Danielle Smith. And yet the proof is in the pudding. When he hires a lawyer who distinctly in an email, and it's in the Toronto Globe and Mail, you know, giving him, you know, sending him a memo. Shit. And all the money, how it was divvied out to that company. Again, this company who's running all these recovery treatment centers in Alberta, how fucking millionaire is that? You know, people can say and do and think, oh, gee. But really, people need to, when Danielle Smith says to the chiefs, check yourselves. What the hell, Danielle Smith? You know, I've grown up with white women like you. I've had white women for breakfast like you. Yuck, what a disgusting thought came out of my mouth. But the reason I'm being so obviously horrific in my description of this woman is because of the way she's used other Indigenous women to write her speeches for her. You know, the way she sort of prostituted herself to the Indigenous leaders in Alberta. And then what? I mean, she's almost like a promiscuous woman. Doesn't, you know, gets off on being in these relationships and then kicking them to the side and walking away. There's no love lost. But you know what she's doing? She knows what she's doing. She's getting pleasure. Pleasure that she can't take with her when she leaves this world. But like I said, Indigenous people and the chiefs of Alberta have come together. And not only that, but even at the national level. You know, when Danielle Smith picks on Indigenous women, especially matriarchs, who have children who are lawyers, who have children who are advocates, who have friends who've been in the political landscape for decades, ever since we were late teenagers. Like, talk about fucking lived knowledge. You know, Danielle Smith, when did you decide that you wanted to understand Indigenous people? In elementary school, high school, junior high, college maybe. You know, I've grown up with white women who were friends of mine in high school. Never once claimed that they had Indigenous blood. Even in college, never once claimed they had Indigenous blood. So that's why I say, what is a fucking pretendian? Someone who tries or even establishes to get a status card has never lived in Indigenous communities. Now, I have arguments with young Indigenous women who say, well, I'm Indigenous, but I've never lived in First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. I say, are you an activist? You know, there's a difference. Because when you're an activist, you get your life threatened. You get called names. You have to protect yourself if you're an activist and if you're a female with indigenous status and you look white. I have, like I say, my great-grandmother had blue eyes, spoke Sioux fluently, educated all of her children. She was under the age of 5 when her family ran away from Minnesota, largest mass execution in American history of 38 Sioux warriors. Advocacy of indigenous women fighting for the rights of their children and grandchildren. Educating racists that have been raised in a systemic racist environment. Look at the cracks in the cracks in our own indigenous homes. Criticizing, well, why don't you fix that fucking crack, you lazy savage? When we say, look, you've been sitting on a pot of gold called the Indian Trust Fund. And that's why you are great. That's why you're living in an urban area. Yet has that money ever come back to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities? Right now we have a lot of Pretendian Métis trying to fight for that Crown land money. Yet what? A lot of the times taxpayers say it's our tax money. No, it isn't. It isn't. You're sure Danielle Smith wants to, work at all these big companies, these oil companies, this Enbridge. Hey, our former chief, Roy Whitney, his company has been dealing with Enbridge, even sending his daughter into BC to negotiate with a former friend of mine who sits on the council in what's that place by Nelson, Kitimat, BC. I have networks. People call me. I know how much money oil companies have thrown to different political leaders within First Nations communities within Alberta. There comes a time when we have to look at how we're protecting our women and children and why they keep on falling through the cracks. And why people don't want to listen to Indigenous women bitch and complain. They're tired of seeing the fry bread burning. They're saying, come on, you stupid women, churn that fry bread over. I'm hungry. I want to eat. Excuse me, but don't you think that the reason it's burning is because we want the attention? You look at all these forest fires. What does Mother Earth say to you? Look at all the data centers in northern Ontario and what Danielle Smith wants to have in Alberta. Do you know in northern Alberta, because of the tar sands, all that groundwater has been sucked up like a sponge in Fort McMurray? So that Indigenous people who used to have bogs underneath the ground have to travel an hour out of the forest to get water. Wonder why the forests are so fucking brittle. Why is Mother Earth burning her fry bread? Are you paying attention? Do you understand it? As the fry bread burns? Bless all the matriarchs in First Nations for their humor. Because when we talk about, this is a soap opera. We'll call it As the Fry Bread Burns. Or as this young white feminist, or I don't know, this white activist is being pulled away from Danielle Smith's pancake breakfast, says, fascist, take your fascist pancakes. Oh my goodness. When you start to understand what the word fascism is, oh my goodness. Sometimes I kid myself and I think, I'm not an international scholar. I don't know what's happening in London, Spain, Rome, Russia, China, Hong Kong. Yet it's the human experience. Fascism is fascism is fascism. And men are men and women are women. So, again, it's tragic. It's tragic that our own people, because of our laziness, or our need to prove that we're smarter than the average Joe, even though we don't have a damn degree between us, or we don't have the wherewithal to compete with other cultures, that we have to bow to the colonial construct of colonialism, to say, look at me, my fry bread isn't burning, I'm the perfect token Indian. Shit. Anyway, I wanted to do this podcast because it just floors me. It totally floors me. Like it's like a jigsaw puzzle or some sort of crossword puzzle, or where you have to draw, or even like years ago they used to have paint by numbers, and you got to put all you got to connect all the dots to see the image, and the reality of like how stingy, how fucking greedy. I grew up in this systemic province. I didn't even know about industrial schools. I didn't even know about Indian residential schools because the government's narrative was so good in indoctrinating and educating those children in Indian residential schools. Until they grew up and started having children and having social problems. Until children like me started getting an education and wondering and trying to understand their parents' behavior, their uncles and aunties' behavior. Like I'm just trying to understand alcohol and addictions. But even that is just the tip of the iceberg or the umbrella for the deep-seated behavior, the constructs of what we feel is comfortable and what we feel isn't. And not understanding that it's not comfortable learning. When you learn, it's not like sitting back watching a movie. To learn or even to understand concepts or constructs takes a hell of a lot of brain power, a hell of a lot of like thinking and talking and having narratives and getting opinions from other people because of how you feel and how you think. It is not easy. And I keep on saying it, like I said before. When I took those men who sexually assaulted me, I believed before that my life was easy. Because I didn't have to think about human behavior. I didn't have to think about like if I was myself gaslighting somebody, if I myself was manipulating somebody, if I myself was lying, if I myself was doing horrific things under the guise of some religion or some policy. My facing my fear and standing alone and talking about my feelings, understanding was I ashamed to be indigenous? Understanding my early childhood and how I perceived what reality was and is today, and how I share a common experience with all of humanity. It takes an effort to think and to have trust with people. And it's the trust that we establish with other people outside of our culture, outside of our comfort zone, that proves and determines just how much we've grown. Now, I'm really grateful for all the networking that I've done since the arrest of Nathan Chasinghorse, and all the spiritual growth that I've managed to keep. Because you got to understand, a lot of these people who gravitate to Nathan Chasinghorse wanted to know their culture. So, and it's important. It takes a lot of hard work. You're going to get hurt by people who pretend to be cohorts and allies. But that's part of learning and lived knowledge. And again, too, it's accepting and releasing. Sometimes when I do talk to people about my feelings, I get offended and hurt because of how they see me. And that's okay. That's their journey. That's not mine. But at the same time, too, I'm amazed at sometimes, like, what I don't understand. Like, I didn't even know what Grindr was. I didn't even, like, I knew what pornography was. Like, things like that. I know when I talk to different people, different backgrounds, they always look at me like, Marina, you're so naive. That's so sweet, you're naive. But that sweetness is very painful when it comes to learning about life. And that people who have some knowledge use it against other people. And that's not my intentions. My intentions have been perfectly open. And that's why I advocate for holistic collective ways of healing. And how in having that you're establishing trust. Because it takes a hell of a lot to heal yourself in order to even trust somebody. And if the family of origin hasn't done that for you, it's within our human capacity to find people who will do this. Now, I'm not saying go run and join a cult. No, that's a taboo. What I'm saying is have the courage to break those boundaries and barriers that keep you safe and sound, or what you think is safe and sound. See, for me, am I safe and sound even though I live alone in my home and I don't network with people in my community unless it's a social event? No, because the mechanisms of patriarchy and taking away women's rights, taking away the rights of indigenous people who've worked decades to help heal our communities. And you have one separatist person claiming that they can get richer by being American. Like, poo-poo. I've lived in the United States. Danielle Smith, or that Roth guy, or that Sam fellow. Jeez. All of their bullshit. That's like listening to Trump. He's a sad sack. Look at me. Look at this. Look at what I've done. Look at the... Jeez. Like, it's a broken record. I mean, jeez. From a different cultural perspective, like, hello? That's... I know, in some senses, I really think non-Indigenous people, when they're listening to me, just like, oh, Marina. Or like they're thinking, at least I'm hoping they're thinking, oh my goodness, she sounds like she's not even Indigenous. No, but I am Indigenous. There are so many things that I'm so ignorant about, so naive about, and yet that's what makes me who I am. And yet I'm trying to give some foundation of why I went through all this shit just to tell my story about Nathan fucking Chasing Horse. Shit. The amount of people that I tried to get him arrested, putting it out there hoping that somebody would say something. This young woman who wrote it on Facebook, like, does she realize how long I've been waiting for her to write something down? And for somebody, some white police officer or somebody, to read it, to charge this bastard? Like, how long did I go out there hoping someone would listen? As much as she despises me and hates me, that she did the job that I hoped she'd do. It didn't care who she was. I didn't know where she would be from. And I hoped and I networked, and everybody who contacted me, I hoped that they were the ones. So yes, with my podcast, talking about just how painful it is to know that we elected officials who did this to us in our community, and that there are other First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities who are not pretending, who are living social injustice every day of our lives. That's why, I really struggle to tell people, don't pretend to be indigenous. I'm telling you in this podcast, this is what it is. Years of networking with people, decades. The director of Nietzsche, the former director, I've known her since I was 19. 30 some odd years ago, over 30 years ago, I was on the board for the Native Women's Shelter. Like, that's decades. Even that in my early 20s, writing a proposal for a detox treatment center, understanding what Nietzsche was, understanding how the federal government was just giving little bits of money, to hire counselors who were burning out, who live it. I'm talking to you who support this progressive conservative government who wants to separate. Look at what I'm telling you. And then I did that was in my, I think about 25. But in my 20s, when I tried going back to high school, mind you, I've got a degree. But to put the budget together for the first daycare center, because I saw that women were trying to work, indigenous women, young women were trying to work like my mother. I'm the oldest, so yeah, I bring a lot of garbage. But the fact is, just from that, understanding that even then we did not have sovereignty over our children. I'm very, like I said, I'm very naive because I've never had children. So the stories that I hear from the grandmothers and the mothers now, as an elder, when I look at their struggles and I know the sacrifices that they've made in their lives, just so that their children could stay close to them, so their children would never ever have to experience themselves living in Indian residential schools. And the audacity of even our own siblings who are still ashamed to be even associated with another sibling because why? They live in First Nations. The hypocrisy and the dynamics of systemic racism lives and flourishes in our communities, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So if somebody who is Indigenous is challenging you with your status card, suck it up, buttercup. We're coming from a place of a lot of systemic racism. And if you have that status card and you've never lived in First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities, advocate. Do you have the courage to be called down, to be threatened with your life, for advocating for the rights of your ancestors who live in First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities? Do you understand how bad it is out there? Once you stop eating the Kool-Aid, like drinking the Kool-Aid, that's what one of Nathan Chasing Horse's followers said. Marina, we were drinking the Kool-Aid and we didn't know. But there's a point where you put the Kool-Aid down and you stop drinking it and you sober up from that Kool-Aid high. And then that's when you face your fears. Because somewhere, someplace, it became systemic for you. In whatever culture or whatever background you come from. So anyway, that's my rant for the day. It's just the reality of how dare people use propaganda and news media to discredit Muslim people. Especially when people like the Republican Party and Daniel Smith and all these cohort men are hiding their bisexuality, their homosexuality, hiding their sexual urges and needs at the expense of who? The most vulnerable, women and children. So yes, there are differences in our sexuality, but at the same time, there's so much that women have been doing for decades since the beginning of time to raise their children. And without even realizing we're giving away our rights as women under this regime of Daniel Smith. Who is it hurting first? Indigenous women and children. The average age for a child to be trafficked in and around this area is 14 years old. When they did the sting operation here on Sutina for 24 hours, 5,000 men tapped into that website for children. When Nathan Chasing Horse came here, his first erotic, he was already into that eroticism of scaring children, so he could sexually feel aroused. So obviously, what he was doing had to have been created even 10 years before. All these things, if he had lived in his home community, exactly, why do people leave? It takes a lot of courage to come home. It takes a lot of courage, and when you do swallow your pride and you do start accepting and being who you are, there's a certain relief of I really don't give a shit. I'm burning my fry bread. I'm the one that's going to eat it, not you. But no, I'm joking. All jokes aside, it's devastating that so many, even though you can see the percolating part of it, the lawsuits and all this happening. Just imagine the children and the women that have had to struggle. When I lived in the States, I didn't get any help from my tribe. Nothing. I worked full time. I went to school. I tried to go to school full time. So yes, of course, I was very critical when I realized that our chief and council were paying rent and education and whatever else that these followers of Nathan Chasing Horse needed. Now, they're very aware of the criticism. But it's going to take a while for the new generation in their 20s and 30s, and even the ones that are being born, to understand the social impact of the legacy we leave behind for the next generation. That's why for me, I keep on promoting the togetherness, being able to trust each other, establishing hope and trust. And bearing witness to our own injustices with people we trust, no matter what color the skin is, because it's only skin deep. We all function at different levels, and I know sometimes my white cohorts probably I really pissed them off, but bless their hearts, they still stick it out with me. So yeah, I do this podcast to also bridge that gap, and hopefully. As they're learning from me, I'm learning from them, and rightfully so, because my white female friends, I know it's not easy. It's not easy to live in your world, and that you have to keep fighting, because you don't want 10, 20 years from now having to have your children, your grandchildren wearing burqas. And not even practicing medicine, law, practicing freedom. So that's what it's all about. We have social media. And yet at the same time, how much of this social media are we understanding? Most of the times when news is being reported, it's only the top. As fat percolates to the top, that's all you see. You don't see the stew that's been created, and whether or not it's tasty or not. So I know I have this analogy of food. You know why? Because I haven't had anything to eat today. With that being said, I'm going to let you go. I just want to thank all my actual cohorts and friends who stuck it out with me, who've helped me be the catalyst for whatever needs to be done and said. You know, I value friendship, and it's also painful for me to let go of those friendships. But in letting go, I realize I gain longevity. And hopefully, Creator will bless me with more years to come.